Welcome back to the Titans of Industry series. Today, I continue my fascinating conversation with Professor Shabir Madhi as we look into the viability of vaccine production on the African continent. Professor Madhi, welcome to the HSS podcast. Let's talk about health in Africa.
Good day. Thank you for having me.
Looking at the developments that have been happening since the pandemic started, it seems that there are quite a lot of players who are stepping forward, getting involved in the vaccine manufacturing space. It may not be end-to-end process. Most of them are doing fill and finish. So you have the IPD in Senegal, you've got Vaxera in Egypt, you've got Aspen in South Africa, and all these other initiatives that are coming up. What could they do, all of these actors who are coming up, in order to actually develop a network across the continent, tapping into those new projects that are coming up to develop a long-term, if you like, pipeline of clinical research that can really drive vaccine production on the continent?
So it's very much for those companies to take it to the next step. So remember, when we're doing fill and finish, as an example, in South Africa with Aspen, just a small percentage of the vaccine that is currently being fill and finished in South Africa is actually being distributed on the African continent. The majority of the vaccine that's being fill and finished, in fact, is going to the European market and the US market. So Aspen has become the largest deployer of J&J vaccines. But very little of that is actually on the African continent, because all of those agreements comes with its own attachments, which is obviously dictated by the patent holders who are setting up these sort of agreements. But what can we do? I think it's really important for those companies to step up. And the biggest challenge that we face when it comes to investment in vaccine manufacture is that it's not really a very profitable business, especially not outside the course of a pandemic, unless you've got a blockbuster type of vaccine, such as a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, which protects against pneumonia, where there's sort of a duopoly between GSK and Pfizer that has lasted for almost 20 years now. Those sort of vaccines, they have a turnover of $8 billion, as opposed to the more basic vaccines, where the turnover is perhaps $100 or $200 million for the entire globe. So the problem that we face is that financially it's difficult for African manufacturers, even in the future, to be competitive against the likes of not just Big Pharma, but also against the likes of the Serum Institute of India and a number of other manufacturers in Southeast Asia. So the business model would need to have the buy-in of all African governments, that they would basically only source vaccines that are produced on the continent from the manufacturers in the continent. And that would require some level of cross-subsidization of these sort of industries on the African continent. In the absence of that, I think you would see many sort of startups pretty much implode within the course of a few years after the COVID pandemic has died down. So it is a complex process. There's huge issues about human talent that's required. There's a huge number of issues in terms of the capital investment. But the bigger issues also speaks to the issue of sustainability of vaccine manufacture on the African continent. And when you're needing to compete with the likes of companies that pretty much captured the global market, including specifically of low-income countries, and are able to produce vaccines at a cost of cents rather than even a few dollars.
Yes. No, that's a big challenge. The market access and how local producers are going to be supported to be able to actually capture, to get market share, where you have very well established players who own much of that. And what governments do is going to be very important to make sure that these nascent sort of production facilities that are coming up are sustainable. But in terms of the production itself, let's say you've taken your product to much later stages, you've done your clinical trials, everything is successful, and you can now produce. Would the Ruby Consortium be looking to establish your own facilities, or would you be looking to establish contract manufacturing agreements, a little bit like J&J and Aspen, or partnering with another local player to co-develop? What is sort of the ambition?
Yeah. So I think in the medium term, it will probably be outsourcing to contract facilities. But certainly, when I'm talking about medium term, I'm talking if we are successful in the next 2 to 3 years with being able to actually go through the R&D and start producing vaccines.
Yes.
But in a 5-year term, the plan here, the business case is to basically look at full manufacturing capabilities.
Yeah.
So that includes the R&D, producing the ABI, the active biological ingredients, and then taking it out right through to fill and finish. So that is the grand vision, but certainly we're needing to show proof of concept. And the best, most sort of risk-averse way to do that is to contract out at the initial stage to facilities that are able to assist with manufacture.
Absolutely. Taking it step by step and building up towards, the vision that you have. So this means that you have to actually raise quite a lot of money to finance all of that. So how much capital has the Ruby Consortium been able to raise to date?
Yeah, so right now we're in discussion with many different potential funders, and I think it's been quite interesting to see the amount of interest that exists, not just on the African continent, but even for funders outside of the African continent wanting to champion this sort of a cause for whatever reason. So right now, the balance sheet is pretty much zero in a sense, but we're putting those sort of agreements together, right, with a number of different potential funders. And I think by the end of this year, we would have some capital investment taking place, which will assist us to be able to get started beyond what the scientists would be doing in the next few weeks, months in the laboratory.
Yes. And in terms of then the relationships that you might look to establish at the beginning to start production, would you be looking to bring in a big player who is very well established with a lot of experience in commercializing vaccine products on the market in a way that, say, BioNTech did with Pfizer? Or are you looking to work with a more sort of local player like BioVac or Aspen?
Well, with regard to partnerships, it's difficult to sort of spell it out right now, but certainly all options would be on the table. I don't think we're looking at the BioNTech-Pfizer type of an agreement, which is largely the major industry players pretty much taking ownership of the process. Obviously, there is material gain to BioNTech as well. But if we are wanting for this to be really African-led, it needs to be African-owned in its truest sense. Which basically means we need to be looking for partnership opportunities on the continent within South Africa as well as outside of South Africa. Yes, we're obviously going to need to engage at different levels with other industry players in terms of the know-how, but the exact nature of those sort of agreements are things that we would need to negotiate as we move on.
Certainly, and working with big players brings its own challenges. The agreement between J&J and Aspen is a case in point where people are not very happy that a lot of the vaccine, that are being filled and finished on African soil are being exported to Europe, which has excess vaccines, which has vaccinated much of its population and leaving the African continent where people are in dire need of the vaccine. So it just shows the power imbalances that can happen in those contracts and agreements with big players and how challenging they can be. Do you think there's a way around those challenges that a lot of companies are facing in terms of their partnerships with big players, where in Western countries they have been able to put export bans for vaccines produced in a particular country, but similar contracts in African countries are not allowed to have those kinds of provisions that would obviously provide security for national populations, and in the case of Africa, for the continent? What can be done? Is it inevitable, or is there a way around that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but at the same time, I think it's extremely difficult for companies to push back when they can't claim ownership of the products, and that is what we currently face as an example with Aspen. I think agreement. So unless those agreements specify a priori that the purpose of outsourcing to companies on the African continent is specifically to actually produce vaccine for consumption locally, we're always going to face these sort of challenges, because at the end of the day, And especially when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, the reality is that many of these bilaterals, which high-income countries and some middle-income countries enter into with the companies, those agreements date back not to when the vaccines were shown to be efficacious, but even before the clinical trials were completed. So companies on their part obviously do have some sort of responsibility in honoring the type of agreements that other countries decided to take on at risk. And those countries are the ones that they essentially have oversubscribed. So, I mean, I find it completely unacceptable that we're producing these millions of doses of J&J vaccine, or at least doing the fill and finish on the African continent, and it's not even becoming available to South Africa, let alone to any other African countries. But at the same time, I think it's about finding yourself in a difficult position where you're really unable to negotiate. Because at the end of the day, if Aspen, I suspect, were not agreeable to J&J terms, J&J would have found another partner in another country, probably outside of the African continent, to set up and do the same. So unfortunate circumstances of events, it just speaks to the issue of lack of social solidarity on the part of high-income countries, and also social unawareness on the part of companies themselves when they enforce these sort of agreements, which are not to the benefit of the continent, and in fact puts the continent back on a back foot in terms of accessing these life-saving interventions.
Yes, no, it's certainly a decision that is very lacking in compassion for the plight of millions of people on the African continent. And on the part of Aspen, I understand they have really, I'm sure they would have wanted to produce vaccines for the African continent. They are an African company, so but obviously it's not their product. They're not responsible for distribution. So there's only so much that they can do. And I think in the end, we have to look at the bigger picture, right? In terms of the capabilities, you know, that they are building up by being able to do the work they're doing right now with the partners. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it's a place to start for them, even if it's not an ideal partnership. It's something that they can build up, and as a continent, we can build up. So what sort of scale would you be looking to, at least what is your ambition in terms of, the scale of production you'll be looking with your consortium? Stephen Saad speaks a lot about the 1 billion doses, so that there's a dose for each African person on the continent. What is your aspiration with the Ruby Consortium?
Yeah, look, it really depends on, again, it depends on which vaccine you're looking at. So as an example, if we were to produce an RSV vaccine for pregnant women, then our target is basically being able to ensure that every pregnant woman on the African continent ends up getting the vaccine that's produced on the continent. So it depends. I think it's difficult to speak about sort of a single figure, but it's about trying to meet the majority of the needs of the African continent. That's where we need to be, what we need to be targeting. Again, the biggest challenge that we face in my mind comes to the issue of sustainability and being competitive in pricing, even when looking at the newer technologies. So I wouldn't want to say that we're wanting to produce 10 million doses or 20 million doses. It really would speak to the need for a specific product. When it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, the reality is that the pandemic will probably be pretty much over, at least when it comes to causing severe disease and death. Those numbers will reduce dramatically once we get 60–70% of our adult population vaccinated, which hopefully will happen during the course of 2022. But by that stage, it's unlikely that we're going to have COVID-19 manufacturing capacity on the continent. But there might still be a need for booster doses moving forward, as an example. And those booster doses won't be for 1.3 billion Africans, but rather for a percentage of those that might remain susceptible to severe disease. And then that is a market that we would want to sort of reach out to and actually provide vaccines for. So I wouldn't, again, we're at a very early stage, and I'm always, as a scientist, a bit cautious about being too optimistic about what we can achieve. I think time will tell. But it's really to start getting those wheels moving so that we can get onto the path of having manufacturing capacity on the continent.
Sure, certainly. No, I understand, of course, yeah, you don't want to over project. But the agreement itself, the licensing agreement that you have, does it give you end-to-end production, control over production, or does it capture some parts of the value chain?
Absolutely. So we've got end-to-end ownership of the entire process with the agreement that we've actually entered with Dyadic. There is obviously them having some sort of shareholding in the process, but that is not an extreme minority stake and more of a profit sharing type of an agreement rather than actually having ownership of the process. Yeah. So this is a very unique approach and unique agreement that they've entered into with Rubik. In fact, quite different from what they've entered into with many of the other countries where they're trying to set up. They've been much more generous in terms of their approach to us. Or to them, and I think that puts us in a better space in terms of the future use of this technology.
Absolutely. No, that's really excellent, that at least once that development process is over, you actually have control over where, which markets you can bring your products to and where you distribute it. But tell me, Prof, I'm just curious. I mean, obviously, Dyadic, like you say, have been very generous. A biotechnology company that is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. How was this project conceived? Did you reach out? Did the consortium reach out to Dyadic, or did Dyadic reach out to you just out of curiosity?
Yeah, interestingly, the consortium was actually established before Dyadic reached out to us. So we had been planning this consortium, looking at different sort of potential models, with the sort of long-term vision of setting up manufacturing capacity from end to end on the African continent in South Africa. And then fortuitously, Dyadic reached out to someone at the university where I'm based at University of Witswatersrand, asking whether there might be any appetite for anyone that would be interested in exploring partnerships with them. So they actually reached out to us and we made those contacts. And since then, things have been moving extremely seamlessly in a sense, where they've been really forthcoming, highly supportive. And again, their idea is to be sort of, the reason why they're into this is that they're wanting to break with the legacy of what's occurred in industry in the past. So very much disruptors in the field of technology, disruptors in the field of vaccine manufacture, and they're wanting to see technology being used where it's most needed.
Certainly, and I think if you're able to produce as cost effectively as you are projecting or looking to do it, this could be a major disruption on the African market, depending on which areas you're able to target. So in terms of the consortium itself, the principals and who's running it, who is the CEO or managing director of the Ruby consortium, and who else is in it?
Yes, at the moment there's about 3-4 directors, and then we've got scientists from the University of Witswatersrand that form part of it. So it's, so the directors include, as an example, Matthew Poza is one of the directors, then there's Julian from the university. So there's a few people from South Africa, but it's sort of a private, I would say it's a private academic type of a partnership. That's leading the program. And I think that private academic link is essential if you're wanting to see this sort of initiatives succeed on the continent.
Yes. And are you looking to get more members in the consortium? And if you are, how do members join the consortium? Is it by invitation, or do you have specific selection criteria that you say, any participants would have to, fill these criteria to be a part of your consortium?
Obviously, we're wanting to be strategic, not just about getting more people in. So what we're trying to do in a consortium is we're trying to expand the number of the people that do come in, but we're obviously wanting to be somewhat selective and targeted, and pretty much headhunting to sort of fill the gaps that currently exist for us to be successful, be it from the manufacturing facility, the R&D part, the marketing, whatever else we would entail. So we're still reflecting on what the additional needs of the consortium would be before we sort of try to target the relevant parties that we think would be able to bring value add to the consortium.
Yes, yes. So what needs to happen now? You know, you've got a great partner who is very generous and considerate in terms of, you know, how this deal, this licensing agreement is structured. Clinical trials are kicking off very soon. So you're almost on the way to get this thing started. What needs to happen in order for the Rubik Consortium to really sort of ramp up and really get going in a you know, meaningful way so that you can start, you know, make progress towards production?
Yeah, so there's obviously multiple things that are occurring in parallel. So the business case has just been almost completed now, and that has been done. We will outsource that part of it. So we've got a good understanding as to the different options available to us and what the cost implications would be of different options. As I mentioned, the raising of capital is something which is currently underway as well, with a number of funders expressing interest or partners expressing interest. And then the most important part in the immediate future is successful technology transfer. And that is something which on my end is my specific focus, to ensure that we've got the right scientists in place, we've got the right sort of facilities in place to be able to bring the technology across, start working on it, and see whether we are successful in replicating what IADIC have been able to do elsewhere. So multiple streams currently at play. And again, I think the next few months, at least the next 12 months or so, will really determine the long-term success of this particular initiative.
Wonderful. So will you be looking to find more technology partners, you know, people with technology that might be beneficial for this consortium? Would you be trying to also reach out to those and attract them to get them to come on board?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because it obviously depends on how big you're wanting to go, how fast. And I think as a proof of concept, what we're wanting to first show is capability and capacity to deliver on at least a single technology before trying to expand to a number of other different technologies, each of which requires its own sort of facilities and its own sort of expertise. So in the immediate future, I think we've now settled for having a protein-based approach to development of vaccines, which speaks to a specific skill set that is currently available and a specific technology that's available. So unlikely that we're going to be looking at multiple other types of technologies to produce vaccines using, as an example, messenger RNA, at least not in the next 2 to 3 years. So we're wanting to consolidate around a single technology, prove that we can actually make it work from end to end before looking at what the future might be. Or remember, Serum Institute of India is an example. A leading manufacturer globally was started off in the 1960s. And it's only over the past 10 to 20 years that it's really firmly established itself. So it's about small steps, rather than being overambitious and then failing.
Absolutely, not spreading yourself too thinly and potentially setting yourselves up for failure by biting more than you can chew. It's a good strategy. So the Rubik Consortium will be entering, you will be entering an African market where you already have others who are ahead of you. Aspen Pharmacare, you know, is an example. You have BioVac, they're already doing fill and finish. You're going for a different ambition, end-to-end production, you know, for a vaccine that you're looking to produce very cost effectively. What do you think is going to set the Rubik Consortium apart, you know, from the other players that already exist in this market?
Yeah, like you said, it's really the end-to-end ownership of the program, which basically gives you complete control as to what you do, what diseases you target, at what space you go about developing those sort of vaccines. So I mean, I would love to see, and hopefully in the next few years, we will see BioVac as well as Aspen sort of mature beyond fill and finish. And I think that needs to be the goal. I mean, I think it should be clear that to be able to adequately service the African continent, we don't need 1 or 2 manufacturers. We need about at least a dozen manufacturers over a short period of time for us to really be able to meet those targets of getting at least 40% of the vaccines that are used on the African continent being manufactured locally on the African continent. So it's, I think the amount of space, there's very little competition for space in this field. It's really about companies being prepared to take it on at risk and understanding that the profit margin with these sort of initiatives is very narrow, except when you get blockbusters such as the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine or COVID-19 or one or two other vaccines. So I think companies, I don't think there's going to be too many companies that compete in the space, but we want as many companies as possible so that we can also see as many technologies as possible being used on the African continent for different vaccines.
Absolutely. I think it will be important for us not to put all our eggs in one basket, right? So we can spread it out, and it's about building the capacity that you need in a pandemic situation that you can then leverage to be able to produce what you need, because the capacity exists even if it's spread out in different areas. Makes sense. So we are reaching the end of our podcast. Prof, do you have any specific asks to potential partners, potential investors? Why should they consider joining or working with the Ruby Consortium? What makes it particularly attractive? Why they should take a look at what you're trying to set up and perhaps consider coming to work with you?
Yeah, I think it's a bit premature to answer that question. And I think in 6 months from now, we probably will have a much better motivation as to why people should take this particular consortium more seriously. But right now, it's like I said right at the start, the success in being able to ensure security of supply of vaccines, not just during the course of the pandemic, but even more generally, is completely dependent on African ownership of the process. And I think the the Ruby Consortium with partnership with DIADC is an example where we truly can sort of lend weight to that type of end-to-end ownership, which is what is required. Again, this also needs to be seen from a public good perspective, rather than just being purely profit motive driven. And because if it is mainly seen as a profit motive driven initiative, I think investors would be very disappointed because the chances of vaccines generally, except again to emphasize for a few blockbusters, they don't sort of have major big turnovers or high profit margins at least. But at the end of the day, it's about partnerships, and the partnership is triangulated between academia, the private sector, and governments. And governments certainly would need to step up and ensure that they actually buy into the concept of procuring locally for these sort of initiatives to eventually benefit the entire continent.
Certainly, certainly. So you want to get to a certain point before you can start publicizing and reaching out to others and saying, come work with us. We have set this thing up and we need your support to get it going.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes. Professor Shabir Madhi, Dean in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Wits in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us today on our podcast.